Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The American heavyweight Michael Hunter, I think he can count himself very lucky, having escaped with a split draw against a very determined Jerry Forrest, who really put it on Michael Hunter and in my view was unlucky not to get the decision. So we'll get to that in a moment, and there were three other heavyweight fights on the card that we will cover off in this video. So you had George Arias versus Cassius Chaney, Trey Lippe Morrison versus Mike Balogun, and also you had Joe Jones opening up the card against Junior Wright. But we'll start with the biggest surprise of the night, which I think was how bad Michael Hunter looked in that main event. So Michael Hunter, as we sort of said in the build-up to this fight, he had not really fought anyone of note in a couple of years since that draw against Alexander Povetkin. He was dropped by Matchroom, then he had a tune-up at the end of 2020, then he had another sort of tune-up earlier this year against Mike Wilson. That was really a nothing fight. The Sean Lockery fight was really a nothing fight. He had sort of failed to impress in the Lockery fight. He looked okay in the Wilson one, but it really obviously, fighting subpar opposition for a couple of years in a row didn't prepare him for what Forrest was bringing here. And bear in mind, this was a rematch. You had Michael Hunter sweeping Jerry Forrest over 8 rounds, taking all 8 rounds on all the cards 7 years ago. Different story here. Arguably, Jerry Forrest won the fight. It was a very competitive first 5 rounds of a 10-round fight, but Michael Hunter faded in that second half of the fight where Forrest just couldn't seem to miss with the straight left. Very competitive opening couple of rounds. You had Hunter really trying to let his power shots go. And I think that was just, some of those shots and that energy expended, I think that sort of caught up with him later in the fight. But overall, I just thought he looked a little bit sluggish. I didn't think his conditioning was great. He looked a little bit sort of flat. I mean, Michael Hunter never looked super ripped and cut unless he was at cruiserweight, when he was at cruiserweight. But he didn't look in as good a shape as he usually does in this one. And there was a point, I think it was after the 3rd or the 4th round, they actually had an in-ring interview with his trainer, Bones Adams, who said that it was hard to get motivated for this fight because they'd had 5 or 6 different opponents. But he looked a little disinterested and unmotivated in there at times, but he couldn't get into a rhythm. He didn't look dynamic. You didn't sort of see that usual sort of sharpness that he has. When he sort of can duck in and out, he looks fleet of foot. I actually thought he looked sluggish, that he looked flat-footed, and in that second half of the fight, I thought he really started to gas, and Jerry Forrest was the beneficiary of that. He was just landing that straight left and really sort of cracking Hunter to the point where he was visibly rocking him at times. Hunter did also have his successes as well. He hurt Forrest on a couple of occasions, visibly, once to the body. There was also a right hand later in the fight, but it was a case that some of this was just a little bit, there wasn't enough activity in general. Forrest was outworking him in a number of these rounds and obviously having more success. My card actually, I had it 96-94, but I did give Hunter a close round, which was round 4, which I thought was a swing round. So it could have been, because I was thinking about giving it to Forrest, but I thought, no, I'll give it to Hunter. Actually, it could have been 97-93. So to get to a split draw of 96-94 for 1 for Hunter, 96-94 1 for Forrest, and 95-95. I mean, I thought Hunter was lucky. I can't find 6 rounds for him. If I give everything to Michael Hunter and another round which may have been a bit close that went to Forrest, I can get to a draw. But I thought Forrest was a bit unlucky not to get the decision. I'm not calling it a robbery, but I thought certainly I had Forrest winning the fight. But people are looking at different things, but I thought overall, Michael Hunter didn't put on a stellar performance, considering he's a guy that many regard as a top 10 heavyweight after some exploits in recent years. Obviously, that draw with Alexander Povetkin, he beat up Sergey Kuzmin and schooled him. Obviously stopped Martin Bakole back in 2018. But you didn't see that style of Michael Hunter in here. He looked very different. I thought he was a bit guilty of loading up at times. I think he was trying to act as a power puncher to just try to get Forrest out of there. They were expecting they were going to stop Jerry Forrest in 6 rounds, and I think Hunter fought like that at times, and it sort of paid the price because Forrest was able to sort of hang around. I think Hunter's got good power, but perhaps maybe he's fallen in love with it, and I thought he was guilty of not throwing a jab, which could have been a punch which could have swung a few rounds for him, because overall, Forrest was the one who was pressing forward. He was the ring general in there. He was the one that was throwing jabs, landing more frequently, and that he was winning rounds through activity and also landing in often many of the rounds, the more cleaner and telling punches. But it didn't look like Hunter was as sharp as he normally is. Sometimes he got a bit predictable. But Triller was just absolutely all over his nuts in early part of the fight. But they started to warm up to the work that Forrest was doing as the fight wore on, as it became evident. Well, actually, he was more than just a live dog, that he had a chance to win this fight. But I thought Blair Cobbs, his commentary was absolutely abysmal, and this was across the card. Effectively, he was all over Michael Hunter's, proverbial, and just couldn't stop writing. It was ridiculous. Just needed to actually have a bit of balance there and see what he was saying, not what he thought people wanted to hear because Hunter was the house fighter. And that sort of stuff irritates me. But where to here for Michael Hunter? Because Triller obviously is invested or has been invested in Michael Hunter, but this performance, they may give sort of a bit of pause for, are they still in the Michael Hunter business? Because, Jerry Forrest is a guy who's generally regarded maybe top 30 to top 40. He's got a sort of position in the heavyweight division. We've seen him in fights against the likes of Carlos Takam, Jermaine Franklin. He sort of failed to sort of throw as many punches as he could have in the Takam fight, but he was certainly in that Franklin fight. But I don't think, on the strength of this performance, you can say Michael Hunter is a top 10 fighter. He might have not got an L here, but I think in the minds of fans, his stock has dropped insignificantly. And people will say, oh, well, fans are fickle and all that sort of stuff. Well, we can only judge on what we're seeing. That was not a top 10 fighter in there doing his thing. He looked certainly on a par with Jerry Forrest, and the best you can say at this point, maybe Jerry Forrest is a top 25 fighter based off that performance, but Michael Hunter couldn't get into a rhythm. There was no dynamism. He looked gassed later in the fight, and certainly he fell short of people's expectations. And I guess, when you're ducking eliminators against the likes of Filip Hrgović for soft fights, well, this could be the result, that you're going to put up a bad performance because you haven't been getting the fights that you need in those key rounds and activity against those better fighters. So a couple of years of a little bit of inactivity in subpar fights came back to bite him on the bum. So moving on to the other fights on the card. So a little bit of drama on this card. There was Cassius Chaney and George Arias. Looked like a well-matched fight. Both these guys undefeated. And the first round or so, you thought, okay, Cassius Chaney looks certainly in this fight, landing a right hand a couple of times, and he was using his height and his reach. The jab seemed to be working early. But he just fell off a cliff after about the end of the second round. Just wasn't throwing punches. Wasn't really using the jab. The jab was just sort of poured out there more as a rangefinder, managed the distance a little bit, but he wasn't using it as a weapon. He wasn't trying to discourage George Arias coming in, but he wasn't unfurling that right hand either. Often there were large stretches where his hands were relatively low. He wasn't doing much. There might have been the odd feint, but there weren't many punches coming. After about, I think it was 4 or 5 rounds, he was on average throwing about 20 punches, 25 punches a round, which is well below the heavyweight average. And because he wasn't letting his hands go, these rounds were slipping away. And you had George Arias, just by way of a little bit more activity, winning rounds. And this was the story of the fight. There was the odd moment where Chaney was hurt and also Arias, but these were few and far between because these guys weren't necessarily going at a hectic rate. Chaney was hardly throwing any punches and Arias wasn't too much better. I thought Arias looked okay in there, but against a guy who's actually throwing punches back, it could have been a much different fight. But yeah, it just kind of ended up petering out to... and this was the shocking thing. The scores came up when the decision... So this was a majority decision to Arias. One judge had 6 rounds for Chaney. I couldn't believe it. I think at most you can give him 3, but I gave him 2. Maybe there was another round in there. He did sort of seemingly hurt Arias with the right hand. Well, not seemingly. He did rock Arias with the right hand in the 6th round, but just not enough. You had Arias rocking Chaney with the left hook in the 3rd round, but yeah, wasn't a lot of action in between. And 99-91 for one judge to Arias, and 97-93 for another, and then obviously the judge that had it for Chaney, 96-94. I think 99-91 is a little bit cruel, but I mean, there's like a massive swing to that card to the 96-94. So Chaney, a missed opportunity, just didn't throw enough punches. It's basically as simple as that. He didn't utilize the height and the reaches as well as he could have. He should have been trying to keep Arias at bay, really popping that jab, using it as a weapon. And where was the uppercut trying to catch Arias on the way in? Just didn't exist. Sometimes Chaney was just getting to the inside, almost zero resistance. Anyway, moving on. So good win there for George Arias. I mean, both these guys were stepping up, and Chaney fell short because he didn't throw enough punches. Trey Lippe Morrison, and he was fighting Mike Balogun. So I hadn't seen too much of Mike Balogun. He's a Lou DiBella fighter, but I'd seen a number of fights of Trey Lippe Morrison, and if you followed this channel for any length of time, I said it was a case of not when, or not if, it was going to be when Morrison was going to lose, and lose by stoppage. And this was the fight. So he went in there against Mike Balogun, and this is another case of terrible Blair Cobb's commentary, waxing lyrical about Morrison and what he's doing in there, and very, very much in control of the fight. Literally a second later, he is dropped by a straight left hand, and not too much later, he's hit with a big left hook, and he's sort of onto the ropes there. He's wobbly. He gets caught again by another shot. The ref decides to give him a count because the ropes had held him up. Doesn't like what he sees after he gives the count, and he waves it off. And I didn't have any trouble with it. He really was not in a good way, although he was protesting that he was fine to continue. He didn't look fine to continue. I was fine with that stoppage. So Morrison, he loses that Mike Balogun, who's 38 years old, advances. So he might be able to be in some fun fights, but I think his level somewhere between top 50 and maybe 80, somewhere there or thereabouts. I don't think he can probably climb too much higher. I didn't have Morrison in my top 50. I thought eventually he was going to lose, and this was the night. And just on to the final heavyweight fight on the card, Joe Jones versus Junior Wright. So Wright was a late notice opponent. He was coming in for Jerry Forrest, who was drafted to the main event. So you might recall Michael Hunter was trying to cherry pick Mark DeMori. Embarrassing. New York State Athletic Commission said, nah, not having it. So we end up having Forrest drafted to the main event. Wright comes in, and this was a fun fight for all of the, just under 2 rounds that it lasted. So the first round, for about the first 2.5 minutes, good back and forth action. Joe Jones was trying to draw the counter, and you had Junior Wright coming forward, aggressive, trying to throw shots to body and head. Ultimately, though, there was a left hook that landed, followed up with a big right hand. It drops Junior Wright near the end of the first round. He beats the count, but, you can tell he's hurt. And the second round, basically within the first 5 seconds, he gets dropped again, and the referee doesn't like what he sees when Wright hits the canvas. Basically, he hit the canvas, landed on his back, and the referee basically was waving his hands. He was out protesting, but ultimately, I didn't have too much problem with the stoppage. I thought it was okay. But in terms of the main event, Michael Hunter escapes with a split draw. Jerry Forrest, I think, unlucky. George Arias gets the biggest win of his career against Cassius Chaney. Trey Lippe Morrison being knocked out. Eventually it was going to happen. And also Joe Jones getting a KO as well. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter. Boxing_squared. I'm out.